Chapter 2. When I was 8, just before I started 3rd grade, my family moved from Upper Manhattan to a working-class Jewish neighborhood in a distant section of Queens. I had never seen anything like it. Trees lined the block, coming right up out of the pavement, and across the street from us was a plant nursery that took up an entire block. I kept looking for forest rangers, or Lassie. Most of the adults in the area went into Manhattan for work, but the neighborhood functioned like a small town in the middle of nowhere. Within a few tree-lined blocks were a library, a post office, a butcher, a baker, a shoe store, an A&P grocery, a toy store, a hardware store, a pizza parlor, and an ice cream shop. I noticed one thing missing, though: a record shop. Most of the buildings were 2-story houses. Some were divided in half to form adjoining row houses. Others, like ours, were divided into 4 apartments, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs, with a yard in the front. I still shared a bedroom with my sister Julia, but my parents had a room of their own now. There were lots of kids in the area. My new school was PS 164. Instead of individual chairs and desks, the classrooms had 2-person desks. I prayed the teachers would put me on the right-hand side so the kid I shared a desk with would see my left ear, the good one. I didn't want anyone looking at what I considered my bad side, not to mention that I couldn't hear people if they were speaking into my deaf side all the time. At some point on the first day, a teacher named Mrs. Sundyke called me up to her desk. I walked to the front of the class. She was looking at my ear. "Oh God, please don't do this." "Let me look at your ear," she said. "No, no, no." She started examining me like a scientific specimen. This was my worst nightmare. I was petrified. I was shattered. What should I do? I desperately wanted to open my mouth and say, "Don't do that," but I remained silent. I took a deep breath and waited for it to be over. If I ignore it, it doesn't exist. Don't show your pain. Not long after that incident, I was taking a walk with my father. "Dad, am I good looking?" He seemed taken aback. He stopped in his tracks and looked down at the ground. "Well," he said, "you're not bad looking." "Thanks." 10 points for my dad. It was just the perfect sort of encouragement that an isolated, hopelessly self-conscious young boy needed. Unfortunately, it would become a familiar pattern with my parents. I started to build a wall around myself. My way of dealing with other kids became to preemptively push them away. I started to act like a smartass or a clown, putting myself in a position where nobody wanted to be around me. I wished I weren't alone all the time, but at the same time I did things to keep people away from me. The conflict inside could be excruciating. I was helpless. A lot of the other kids in the neighborhood went to Hebrew school together, which reinforced their friendships from PS 164 and created others beyond school. My family lit candles and observed Jewish holidays in some vague ways, but we weren't very observant. I was never bar mitzvahed. But the reason I didn't go to Hebrew school had nothing to do with any of that. I simply told my parents I didn't want to go. What I didn't say was why. Sure, I felt Jewish, but I didn't want to subject myself to being around any more people. Life was bleak enough without putting myself into even more situations where I would be paralyzed by the fear of humiliation. "Okay, school lets out at 3 o'clock. Hey, how about more of the same at 3:30 from a different batch of kids?" Great. PS 164 did have a glee club that interested me, a chance to sing. Every year they put on a musical and they auditioned anyone who wanted to try out for a part. The first year I decided to audition. When it was my turn, I stood up on the stage in front of other people, opened my mouth, and expected to sing. But all that came out was a little squeak. I ended up in the chorus, an able seaman in HMS Pinafore or whatever. Every year after that, 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, I wanted to roll in one of those productions, but every year I choked at the audition. That same tiny voice was all that came out. I ended up in the chorus every time, despite the fact that when I sat through the auditions, I knew I could outsing many of the students who managed to land the leads. PS 164 was also the home to a scout troop. After I saw a few schoolmates in their blue uniforms, I thought about joining. When a new friend of mine, Harold Schiff, showed up in his uniform, I took him up on his offer to go with him to a meeting. Harold ran with the mainstream kids, but had also befriended a few loners like me. He was tight with some other guys in the troupe, like Eric London, who played in the school orchestra with Harold, and Jay Singer, who played piano. I had run across Eric and Jay in Glee Club, but their friendship with Harold was based more on attending Hebrew school together. I stuck to myself for the most part. Even when I joined something, I operated at the periphery. Everybody in the Scouts was trying to get merit badges for tying knots or helping old ladies cross the street, but I didn't give a crap about that stuff. The only thing that appealed to me was going camping. And sure enough, we took some weekend camping trips. But I had a problem when I lost sight of the other people when we were out hiking. That was really the first time I realized that being deaf on one side meant I had no sense of direction. I remember standing in a clearing listening to someone yell, "We're over here!" I had no idea where the voice was coming from. Without the ability to triangulate the sound, it was impossible. I felt vulnerable because I didn't know where I was. Yet another way I couldn't place myself. My instinct was still to cling to my parents. But whenever I got home from a situation like that, looking for a sense of security, they let me down. Ignore it and it will go away remained the household mantra. Same old story. I would have loved more assurance and less hitting, but it just wasn't going to happen. My parents steadfastly refused to acknowledge the trouble I was having despite the fact that it was so obvious. I sleepwalked at home. Sometimes at night I would sort of come to and realize I was in the living room. Sometimes I was aware of my parents turning me around and directing me back to my bed. They knew. They just never acknowledged it or tried to figure out what was wrong. I also had 2 recurring nightmares. In one, it was pitch black and I was on a floating dock in a huge body of water far from any shore. I was stranded and alone. I started yelling for help. Night after night. I'm alone on a floating dock far from shore, surrounded by darkness. I would wake up screaming in my bed. In the other nightmare, I was sitting in the driver's seat of a car barreling down a dark, empty highway. The car had no steering wheel. I had to try to maneuver it by leaning from side to side, but there was no way to control it. Night after night, these nightmares left me suddenly awake, screaming, confused, deathly afraid. Things with my sister were going south too. By the time I was in junior high, Julia was getting more and more self-destructive. My parents started periodically committing her to state mental facilities. After she bounced in and out of state facilities, my parents spent what for them was a fortune on an expensive private psychiatric hospital. When she was at home, she ran away a lot, and my parents could spend days looking for her. Sometimes I woke up in the morning to see my parents had gone yet another night without sleep, and I wondered, will all this kill them? Julia would hang out in the East Village and crash at people's apartments and take drugs. Once when she was at home, she stole a drawer of silver dollars my mother had been collecting and sold them to buy drugs. I know now that what she was doing would be called self-medicating, but back then, I didn't analyze it much. When she was gone, and when she was there, I was scared. One afternoon, after my parents brought Julia home from an institution where she had received electroshock therapy, they left us home alone. They just dropped her off and left me with a violent nutcase only a few hours removed from a mental hospital, who just happened to be my sister. While they were out, Julia got angry at something and started chasing me around with a hammer. I was terrified. I ran into a bedroom and locked the door. I sat there listening at the door, swallowing hard, praying my parents would come home. Oh God, please come home. Then I heard a crashing sound as Julia started swinging the hammer wildly at the door. She kept at it. Bang, bang, bang. The wood cracked and splintered, and the hammer began to wedge its way through the door as she continued to flail at it with all her strength. Then suddenly she stopped. The hammer was lodged in the wood and everything went quiet. I curled up and counted the minutes and then the hours. Will they come home before she starts up again? They did. What happened here? They asked. I told them that Julia had come after me with the hammer. But then they lashed out at me, as if it was my fault. They yelled at me, then they hit me. I had been so scared and now my head reeled in confusion. You left me with her. That was your choice, not mine. She tried to kill me. School continued to be a challenge too. When I was in grade school, I had tested my way into the gifted and talented track. At the start of junior high, I was once again placed with the gifted children. I wouldn't have made it on the basis of my grades. I was never a good student. But entrance to the gifted track was gauged purely on some sort of intelligence test. While my IQ apparently qualified me, I remained at the bottom of the class. I was the one they scratched their heads about. I guess they thought I didn't want to learn. What they failed to realize was that my ear put me at a terrible disadvantage. I simply couldn't hear a lot of what was said in class, and if I missed a sentence, I was lost. Once I got lost, I surrendered. I gave up because I'd lost the thread. At parent-teacher conferences, the teachers always told my parents the same things. He's bright, but he doesn't apply himself, or he's bright, but he doesn't work to his potential. No teacher ever told them he's bright, but he can't understand what I'm saying. Back then, kids didn't benefit from the recognition of learning disabilities. But my parents knew I was deaf in one ear, and yet after every parent-teacher conference, they came home and admonished me. God gave you this wonderful brain and you're not using it. I cried. I felt guilty. Tomorrow I'll turn over a new leaf, I vowed. Which was all well and good until I went back to school the next day and still couldn't hear. At which point I couldn't follow what the teacher was saying, and there I was, feeling like a quitter all over again. I knew that if I didn't do something, things were going to end badly. Did that mean failure? Did that mean taking my own life? I wasn't sure. To live in misery, to live a lie, to take it out on other people, I knew this was all bad, and I knew it was untenable. I didn't know where it would end, but I knew it would end badly. It was a horrible situation, and I stewed over it at night. In addition to the nightmares and sleepwalking, I became a hypochondriac, in the extreme. I believed I was dying. I would lie awake at night, afraid to fall asleep lest I never wake up. Eventually, I would doze off, unable to keep my eyes open any longer. It was the same every night. You're dying. You're in trouble. Then lo and behold, I got my first transistor radio. It opened an entirely different world, a separate place where I could go whenever I put the single earpiece in my functioning left ear. Music once again became my sanctuary, giving me at least a fleeting sense of safety and solitude. And in February 1964, a few weeks after my 12th birthday, I saw the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show. As I watched them singing, it hit me. This is my ticket out. Here was the vehicle I could use to rise out of misery, to become famous, to be looked up to be liked, to be admired, to be envied. And with no rational basis, I convinced myself, I can do that. I can touch that nerve. I had never played a guitar in my life, and I certainly had never written a song. And yet, this was my ticket out. I just knew it. Immediately, I started to grow my hair out, aspiring to a Beatles mop top. Partly I did it for style, but it was obvious why the style appealed to me. I could cover the stump I had instead of a right ear. Somehow, this was lost on my parents. They badgered me as my hair grew out and threatened to cut it. One afternoon, not long after I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, I bumped into a kid from my neighborhood named Matt Rail. He told me he had an electric guitar and played music. He was a grade behind me in school, but I was very impressed. All I needed now was an electric guitar, and I too could start playing music. And I thought I knew how to get one. For the next 11 months, as the British invasion quickly brought not only the Beatles, but the Dave Clark Five, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, the Searchers, Manfred Mann, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Animals, the list was endless. I pestered my parents for an electric guitar for my 13th birthday. It means the world to me, I told them.